هيدي المداخلة مداخلة خاصة بالنسبة لإلي. ريجين سحاكيان كان المفروض تكون موجودة ببيروت، ما قدرت تجي. هي بعد كل الانفجارات اللي صارت ببيروت وبباريس، ريجين كان صعب عليها كتير تجي لأنه عندها رضيع عمره 2.5 شهور وكان صعب تكون موجودة. بس أصرت على قراءة مداخلتها اللي لها فترة عم تشتغل عليها. وبشكر رشا سلطي اللي قبلت إنه تقرأ هيدا النص، وبعدين رح نفتح النقاش. أكيد نحن ما بنقدر نجاوب على ريجين، بس يعني بنتمنى انه تعطوا كل الملاحظات تبعيتكم، نفتح النقاش ونبعته لريجين سهاكيان بعدين. I'm going to talk in English. Thank you for coming. This is a very special slot for me as a friend and a dear collaborator and colleague. Rijin Sahakian, the director of Saha, was not capable of coming to Beirut. Because she has a baby who is 2.5 months and could not fly after the developments that happened. Rasha generously accepted to read her intervention, and then we are going to open the Q&A to give your comments, to discuss directly with Rijin. We are not going to answer questions pretending that we are Rijin. We are going to open the floor. We're going to give you the email of Rijin and you take it from there. Thank you, Rijin, for sending this our way. I think Rijin is awake. It's 5 o'clock now. Thank you for sending this, and I hope you are listening to us and the connection is fine. And sorry, I did a mistake. Rijin is the director not of Sada in Iraq. Thank you, Rijin. Thank you, Rasha. And please feel free to put all your comments, any intervention, any question you want to put to the floor to Rijin. We'll give you her email after the end of this session. Thank you.
I want to begin by thanking Christine for giving me the opportunity to embody somebody that I absolutely love and admire. And I think this is something we should consider, embodying other people who cannot be there, just to make sure that they are there. And I hope that next time I'll be Ingrid Bergman. So, around this time, 2 years ago, I moved back to the States after living in Beirut and Amman for several years. Another chapter in the Iraq war had begun with the onset of ISIS, and soon after, the escalation of war in Syria became impossible for major news outlets to ignore. At the same time, images of black men and women being beaten, shot, and/or killed by US police became regular evening news. Subsequent protests and calls for justice intensified with the building of the Black Lives Matter movement. These contexts, steeped in long histories, were not only surfacing into mainstream discourse, but revealing narratives about state violence, how this violence has and continues to live and permeate in public, private, and personal spheres. This escalation has only continued. At the time I first began writing this, with protests throughout the US, in Baghdad, Gaza, Beirut, and perhaps the largest protest in favor for the right to live realized through the historic swell of Syrians and others seeking refuge in Europe. Now, recent attacks have added further magnification of the conflict in Syria and growing fears that what has been taking place in the Middle East cannot or will not be contained. For all the articles, exhibitions, and hysteria around the Arab Spring throughout 2011, what has become more clear is that the spring is now. A spring where policies and actions sown have come into full bloom. not spontaneous, not surprising, but a natural outcome planted days, years, decades ago in the twinned histories of the Middle East and the US and their respective allies. Beliefs in the myths of an East versus West, democracy versus dictatorship, freedom versus oppression, dissolve under the glare of these long histories, exposed ever more widely in image after image. In the States, the myths that undercut this long view of history as related to the black body was summed up by writer Ta-Nehisi Coates as the dream. He writes, "Son, last Sunday, the host of a popular news show asked me what it meant to lose my body. The host was broadcasting from Washington, D.C., and I was seated in a remote studio on the far west side of Manhattan. A satellite closed the miles between us, but no machinery could close the gap between her world and the world for which I had been summoned to speak. Specifically, the host wished to know why I felt that white America's progress, or rather the progress of those Americans who believe that they are white, was built along looking and violence. Hearing this, I felt an old and indistinct sadness well up within me. I realized then why I was sad. When the journalist asked me about my body, it was like she was asking me to awaken her from the gorgeous dream. I have seen that dream all my life. It is perfect houses with nice lawns. It is Memorial Day cookouts, block associations, and driveways. The dream is tree houses and the Cub Scouts. The dream smells like peppermint, but tastes like strawberry shortcake. And for so long, I have wanted to escape into the dream, to fold my country over my head like a blanket. But this has never been an option, because the dream rests on our back, the bedding made from our bodies. And knowing this, knowing that the dream persists by warring and with the known world, I was sad for the host. I was sad for all these families. I was sad for my country. But above all, in that moment, I was sad for you." End quote. What is absorbed and absolved through the dream is a systemic apparatus of oppression, psychological, economic, pragmatic, willful. A foundation that did not erode during the civil rights era, but has been continually reinforced through the brickwork of reinvented Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration, redlining neighborhoods, police brutality, deliberate mechanisms by which the capital of Black lives has been used despite and even in support of the mythology and related economies of a just and equal America. The destruction and use of populations as capital, as a major economic force, has been waged through the enforcement of mythologies about the Middle East as well, particularly in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. This is not about a singular state, but the comprehensive deployment of visual and psychological tools used to enact a series of false constructions. These fables serve to mystify a cogent set of policies whose outcomes rely on and necessitate destruction and exploitation. This is not, by any means, a lone effort by the US, and in no way evades domestic and regional culpability. Collaboration is deeply interconnected. Thusly, the idea of East versus West, freedom versus oppression, the civilized and the beastly, a hollow drumbeat. In Syria and Iraq, the idea that dictatorships provided stability, quote unquote, and that wars and occupations could be enacted over decades with no significant repercussions are widely accepted pretenses. The brutality of these regimes have hardly been discussed. The rise of ISIS and the splintering of numerous factions and militias in both countries only recently discussed as a possible misstep in international policy, one whose fault lines in these areas being ungovernable, intrinsically violent and fratricidal, Iraqis, for example, simply could not accept Western-style democracies, an oft-repeated myth that rests on pretending embezzlement, corruption, multinational corporate contracting, sectarian division, imprisonment, civilian abuse, rezoning of neighborhoods, and militia training was not simply the legacy, but composite policy of the occupation. An occupation that came after decades of support for Saddam Hussein and his known abuses, two wars whose destruction continues to reverberate in environmental, physical, and psychological damage, and the cumulative effects of this history compounding as years pass with continued devolvement of internal systems of civic life and governance. Protests in Baghdad against the corruption of the government have continued since the summer, in a gesture that belies the idea that Iraq is a so-called quagmire, because the people themselves just did not or could not accept democracy, American values, American freedoms. Again, these attempts to mystify Iraqis when the values set forth, corruption, disregard for human life, and the extraction of capital from environments and people, have been coldly and hardly mysteriously set up for Iraq to fail as a state. What mythologies do the politics of art infrastructures reveal? The arts have a special ability to be used for dual purposes, laundered not just financially, but in its redesignation for the realms of civic and humanistic worlds. These worlds, which in many ways serve and reinforce claims of clarity-making, investigation, discourse, preservation, high notes of expression and communication. But to whom, for whom, and by whom? What actors and ideas are being legitimized through these infrastructures? As prolonged wars, poverty, and oppression take stronger hold, the Middle East art scene is touted, even growing, a major new market with exciting new initiatives, exhibitions, and international interest. Descriptions of spectacular new acquisitions accompany the equally spectacular leveling of libraries, neighborhoods, and other sites of culture. We do not know the outcome of such historic erasures in such condensed periods of time. We can only know that these places, these generations, will be irrevocably remade. While something else, something very different, in the world of visual culture and the arts is being made. Museums are being built, catalogs and histories compiled, pavilions, auctions, and openings setting records of participation and finance. This building, compiling, buying, and selling is most often described as providing, preserving, and disseminating new avenues of knowledge, new modes of representation. This rise in interest in Middle Eastern art, however, can be attributed in no small part to the raging wars that have upped the interest as a whole in the region, and the vast sums being spent by the Gulf as part of a strategic art and cultural plan. The effects of this could not be underestimated or overstated. As the headline-gripping amounts of monies being spent on art and its associated architecture make their way through international newspapers, so too do narratives about artworks, cultural production, and the relationship to the region. It would be naive to pretend that all the intensified interest in art from the Middle East is not substantially due to the prospects of major sales, funding, and media attention. Museums in London and New York have board members with vested interest in heightening the profile of their collections or art initiatives, and the ongoing upheavals in the region provide a consistent backdrop of interest and inaccessibility, creating a perfect climate for alternate, unchecked narratives to spin. This is not unlike mainstream American news coverage of events in the Middle East, where a lack of deep knowledge combined with government war mandates has provided the aforementioned myths of inherent Arab violence and inexplicable endless war. This is not to say that the myths being perpetuated are the same. They are not. They do, however, both rest on war-making and profiteering as their motivating force. The Gulf states are aggressively driving the contemporary Middle East art market, which has also ushered in new patrons, some of whom would too like to dry their war-soaked reputations on the world of art. This matters precisely because the narratives being written in newspapers and in curatorial statements are not only resulting in misinformation, but also serves as a cover for the fact that as these wars rage on, artworks, antiquities, documents, and other forms of narrative continue to be destroyed, prevented from being produced, or displaced in the service of those claiming stewardship in the arts. This happens through direct and indirect means. If ongoing wars in Iraq and Syria ruin educational and cultural infrastructure, it's easy enough to come to their rescue by offering to take, buy, or borrow works for safekeeping. At the same time, a generation or more will not have the same ability to take part in an arts or cultural sector if it has been compromised, if they have to flee, or more bluntly, are killed. These aren't hysterical theoreticals, but very normalized possibilities. The Gulf states, particularly with the United Arab Emirates, make no secrets of its singular support of the war on terror and US-led, UAE-enabled UAE-enabled military efforts. In fact, a short video, helpful infographic, and timeline on the UAE embassy in Washington's website makes this synergy as clear and public a statement as possible. All of the cultural initiatives and major art fairs and events in the UAE are directly funded by the government and ruling family members, of which there is no separation. The About section of the Dubai Art Fair, for example, highlights that the event is held under the patronage of specific members of the ruling family. The ladies' preview is under the patronage of Her Highness Sheikha Manal bint Muhammad bin Rashid Al Maktoum, President of Dubai Women Establishment, wife of His Highness Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Presidential Affairs, UAE. This is the same deputy minister who recently posted a picture of himself in battle in Yemen under the hashtag selfied during war. This war, led by Saudi Arabia, its coalition of Gulf states, and logistically supported by the US, is one in which the richest nations in the world have unleashed a humanitarian disaster in the poorest nation in the Arab world. In less than a year, more than 2,000 civilians have been killed and 1.5 million Yemenis displaced. Coalition blockades of food and aid have pushed 6 million people to the brink of starvation, leaving the entire country at risk for famine. The heads of the International Committee of the Red Cross observed that Yemen, after 5 months, looks like Syria after 5 years. While Abu Dhabi has rightly come under scrutiny for its labor practices in building Saadiyat Island, there surely should be some concern regarding the loss of life that underwrites patronage of the wars on terror and art initiatives alike. Patronage cannot be selectively enjoyed. Qatar houses the largest US Air Force base and military command center in the world. Dubai, and to a lesser extent Sharjah, is an invaluable air and sea hub for military contractors and third country nationals used for cheap labor by military subcontractors. Halliburton, Blackwater, and their subsidiaries have found homes in the UAE after dealing with fallout in the US due to widespread allegations of embezzlement, shadowy policies, and excessive force against civilians, becoming their largest contractors alongside the US. The ruling families who ensure these policies also head and architect their arts and cultural strategies. Today, Qatar is known as one of the biggest buyers of art in the world, if not the biggest. Dubai is host to Christie's, the Dubai Art Fair, and a growing number of galleries. Sharjah home to the Sharjah Biennale, and Abu Dhabi will become home to both A. Guggenheim and the Louvre. The UAE's investment in arts and culture that can perhaps only be rivaled by its military and defense spending, much of it in the service of enabling war in the region, it is building its arts. The UAE's investment in arts and culture that can perhaps only be rivaled by its military and defense spending, much of it in the service of enabling war in the region, it is building its arts and cultural sector to supposedly serve. Somehow, the narrative manages to toe the line that these arts and cultural initiatives are about bridging East versus West and a commitment to support regional artists. Support for regional artists is a key strategy in securing a sustainable art market central to the Gulf's aims of becoming a nexus in the global art scene. The idea that there is a lack of bridges between East versus West when it comes to the Gulf is only laughable, considering its replication of Western-style shopping centers, hotels, and amenities, but also disingenuous when the Emirates themselves tout their united front with the US in every major sector. This only serves to support the incongruous myth that there is an East and West that must be bridged, and an us and them that greater communication might bring together. As one popular royal collector stated in a well-circulated interview, quote, open quote, they, artworks, help counter the brutal images of destroyed neighborhoods and beheadings so prevalent in the news. We are taking the narrative away from these extremists. We are building bridges of communication with the Western world and the Eastern world, end quote. This sounds quite nice, benign even, but wouldn't not participating in wars be more effective in countering these brutal images? The narrative is not one that extremists are building. It is one that extremists as well as war makers and profiteers are building. And why should we divert attention from destroyed neighborhoods and beheadings? If anything, more attention, more studied, thorough attention should be paid to the humanitarian crisis in these areas, the actors and factors responsible, rather than attempting to divert attention or promoting the Emirati party line that investment in culture is to support the future of Arab arts, when they are helping to dismantle it outside their own borders. Furthermore, the idea that collectors are building bridges with arts from the region during these times is another fallacy, when conditions are only pushing artists actually living in sites of war further and further away. Most of the artists being touted as representing the region do not, for the most part, live in the region. Or if they do, they enjoy special standing, class, or access to the arts not afforded to the majority of the population. The category of Middle Eastern art is always riddled with questions about naming. Is it art from the Middle East, Arab art, art from the Menasa region? I am often surprised that this question of naming is hotly contested, but the fact that entry into contemporary Middle Eastern art is hardly discussed. Is hugely removed from many of the artists living in countries that fall into this sector or market is hardly discussed. This is in no small part due to the conflicts at play and the levels of education and types of literacy needed to read, understand, study, and participate in this world. It almost always requires an advanced art degree, generally in a foreign country. This generally requires funding, the ability to obtain a visa, previous training in the arts, and English literacy. For those living in countries being ripped apart by war, still reverberating from its repercussions, or without access to the funding and education needed to get to this stage, a sustainable life as an artist is going to be far from possible. And so many artists are in exile, have had the means or opportunity to study outside their home countries, or have the ability to live between countries. Why then is there not more discussion on access to the arts for those working and living exclusively in the region? Especially when so many of the exhibitions and shows use the politics of the region as a starting point. I have heard many bemoan the lack of artists coming from Iraq, grotesquely choosing to ignore the factors that might speak to this: lack of opportunity, literacy, travel barriers, or say, the targeting of intellectual and artist life that has been taking place for years on end. Highly publicized fairs and biennales promote a Middle Eastern art scene that provides almost no funding for the strengthening of local artist education centers or initiatives. Even funds supposedly aimed at those working and living in the Middle East require grants to be submitted in English, or utilize application processes that are completely unfamiliar to applicants. If funds and prizes are meant to go to artists in the region, why aren't grants made available in Arabic? Why aren't there tutorials in Arabic on how to write a grant, make an artist portfolio, or propose a budget, when it is common knowledge that these are not components taught in most areas in the Middle East at all, let alone in art schools if one happens to have had the opportunity to attend one in the region. Writing grants is laborious and daunting, even for those familiar with the process. For those who have almost no familiarity with the process, it is an almost certain deterrent to being able to apply for any kind of funding for a project or enter into alternative funding sources than the state, which for the most part are entirely non-existent or prohibitively problematic. Moreover, if funds are made available to those on the ground in areas of strife, it is often to do with some kind of a social project dressed up as art, with funders seeking production that address civil society through any number of concerns, be it the plight of women or reconciliation. Why would artists be tasked on taking on issues of conflict or conflict resolution when dealing with their own lives, and with issues one can safely assume no one in granting offices is dealing with or has any sense the reality of living through? Why wouldn't creating their own work be enough? Instead, they are often used to reinforce a granting organization's idea of what its values are, rather than serving the actual needs of marginalized artists. These assaults on the individual take many forms. another means by which one's own experiences become marginalized and cheapened, currency devalued. Where young artists who don't have an educational pedigree, a sophisticated artist statement, or the right social navigation skills to be dealt with head-on or supported. In this way, ordinary experiences are secondary to the more exotic, supposed discoveries of a long-known, vibrant Jewish Iraqi population or a gym that Iraqis drive by every single day. The reality is that for all the panel discussions on art in the Middle East today, young, curious, intelligent people who want to understand what is taking place in their lives, who want to create something because that is simply who they are, and who live in a world they, and any one of us, would be desperate to get out of, are not supported, not able to experiment or to make mistakes. Instead, they have to think about what they could possibly come up with that would impress us, that would be able to bypass their lack of training, because their schools are destroyed or in shambles, their lack of language skills, because literacy has plummeted, their lack of practice. They have to find any common denominator that we might like. So while so much of the dialogue swirls and monetizes in fantastic ways around Middle Eastern art, many living in the realities of the Middle East could not be more foreign. They are a kind of bad aftertaste to a party, even though the impetus for all these parties, all these openings, is in no small part due to the turmoil that is rocking in the area, which they bear the brunt of. And so we look at the slums, and instead of investing in education or policies of support, we maybe pluck one out like a basketball agent or scout, and they might get a visa, and they might get a new start, maybe even a European girlfriend or an Emirati patron. Contemporary and modern art histories, stored, exhibited, and researched in sites removed from their context, are part and parcels of the spoils of war. It is easy enough to make the case for safekeeping and documentation during times of upheaval. It can even be a callous side comment. In an obituary piece for the recently deceased Ahmad Chalabi, an Iraqi politician and CIA operative, a reporter notes that Chalabi's Baghdad compound is home to a trove of paintings from Iraq's National Collection of Modern Art, end quote. This is not looked into further, but written off with the note that Chalabi assured me it was only for keeping the art safe from looters and extremists. In 2013, a spread in the London Times on the Iraq pavilion at the Venice Biennale noted the invaluable logistical support provided by Chalabi in making this production possible. Support in the form of personal brigades of bodyguards, armored vehicles, and the use of the aforementioned compound in Baghdad, luxuries only afforded the military and political elite in a country with the dubious recognition of being one of the most corrupt amongst governments and dangerous for its citizens in the world. The article was introduced with a spread that may be one of the most inadvertently realistic and camp images to illustrate art in the service of military supremacy, a succinct example of East/West art war porn fetish. This would be laughable were it not yet another example of individuals and political layers heeding war, culture, and arts, heading war, culture, and arts initiatives directly benefiting from and selectively choosing what and whose histories are written, artistic and otherwise. The financial motivations for expanding the arts is not only in reference to contemporary work. There has been a surge of interest in Arab modernism, with increased auction sales, museum acquisitions, and exhibition of artists from the era at museums like the Tate and Whitechapel in London. Toward this, auction houses like Christie's Department of Modern and Contemporary Arab, Iranian, and Turkish art are writing much of the art history around these works, with additional plans for research in places like the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi and the Mathaf Arab Museum of Modern Art, raising their interest, exhibition, and sale prices. This removal and cataloging of people's cultural histories is not simply an issue of the art world, nor is it new. Museums all over the world are filled with the archives and battles and places lost in the form of objects and records displaced from the environments from which they are created. In places like Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, however, sites that have been part of people's homes and sense of identity for centuries have been wiped out while simultaneously being used as a call to arms. Last fall, John Kerry made the case for increased US attacks in Iraq during a speech at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. During the museum's exhibition program, Heritage in Peril, Iraq and Syria. Speaking in front of the impressive Temple of Dendur as a backdrop, Kerry stated that, quote, "For the proud people of Iraq and Syria, ancient civilizations of great beauty, great accomplishment, of extraordinary history and intellectual achievement, the destruction of their heritage is a purposeful final insult and another example of ISIL's implacable evil. Extremists want to rob future generations of any connection to this past. That is profoundly what is at stake. If you leave it unstopped, if you don't stand up, we are all complicit." End of quote. Kerry is correct in noting the robbing of future generations of their past in Iraq and Syria. This is the case not only through the loss of ancient sites, but the cities, towns, and neighborhoods that have been casualties of ISIS, as well as the US coalition-led wars. There is no discussion of the use of Babylon as a coalition military base, which caused irrevocable damage. No discussion of the roots or funding of ISIS. No discussion since the bombings in Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition that has used US weaponry and logistical support to decimate UNESCO-sanctioned heritage and archaeological sites which have remained populated by Yemenis for more than 2,500 years. Indeed, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen are home to some of the most ancient, continuously populated areas until now. What apparently cannot be trusted with safekeeping are precisely the things that make one's place a home: its records, objects, sites of interest, its history, its people. Instead, they are removed, catalogued, archived, and documented for further research by others, most certainly those that have played a role in their reorganization as a space for research rather than a living indigenous site. The acquisition of so many of these works made possible through upheaval, using violence on the one hand to make any kind of preservation or production more difficult, while on the other building sites where this culture becomes deadened, out of context, an object of study for others. How can one mine their own history when their neighbors are gone, their elders, their museums, the books and pictures unable to be carried, these sediments of peoples and objects blown away forever or into far corners of the world? These museums and initiatives build up their mythologies of sanctity and civilized care, engorging themselves on the decay of sites that they stake their reputations on. This attention has brought in what art always does, Opportunity for some artists, perhaps, but also for the wealthy and aspirational to stake a claim to the heady territory of humanistic value, notoriety, and a specific brand of internationalism that only the art world can carve out. Initiatives touting preservation and human engagement are buzzed about as viable truths, while serving very obvious, hardly hidden purposes to divert culpability under the guise of cultural bridges and understanding, legitimize legacies, and increase social currency among both individuals and nation states, using the capital of cultural production and economic engineering. Here, these acts take on a perverse kind of archive, a harvesting of people, places, and things. One would imagine that it should be of concern to artists and curators that those advancing the wars in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and Afghanistan are directly funding the art initiatives in which they take part, securing these legitimizing efforts through their participation. How stale is it to continue the old idea that work can only be done through patronage, that all money is dirty money, that this is just the way the arts has always been? If anything, artists and curators who often claim an investigative quality to their work and research should be at the forefront of seeking out how this surge in the market and its consequences are being used. Let's stop having panel after panel about what the arts can do until we can acknowledge that the myths produced by nation states mirror those produced by particular art worlds, which should come as no surprise when the two are so closely aligned. There are connections to be examined, alternatives that have always existed and may be necessary to revisit or explore fully anew. Perhaps this is old news, but let it be spoken out loud, discussed, acknowledged, instead of bubbling underneath every money-saturated opening. Carefully worded exhibition on the MENA, MENASA, or fill-in-the-blank region. Let that debate stop covering up for some attempt at feigned politics instead of political realities. Maybe then we can get a bit closer to looking, investigating these moments. Because to be sure, the near absolute destruction of these countries is indeed a moment, if there was ever one. Thank you. I think you should, if you have questions, you should give them to Garin or Christine, and they will convey them to Rijin, for sure. Thank you.